Okay, so you want to start reading C.S. Lewis biographies, but you don't know where to start.
Look out, tell them, look out for my
That's
worldview.
where I come.
Cloudy when you sinking, got you thinking it's a whirlpool. Caesar in your pockets, you can't see who's in your pockets, but Stevie's inner visions touch your eyes and make the world move. Wifey bob her head and make her curls move. Crown jewel is character, and this ain't immortality.
My name is Luke. Welcome to Belfast, dedicated to those deconstructing and reconstructing their faith. I've been reading some Lewis biographies as of late. I've read two in their entirety. I've read three, all three that I'm going to talk about today. I have read, but I read two very recently. One I read a while back. When I say a while back, I mean a few years ago. So, and that one I'll get into it, but I didn't really know what to do with it. I didn't know how to parse it out. But anyway, so we're here to talk about Lewis biographies. As many of you probably know, I am a Lewis stan. I love Lewis very much. Don't pay attention to the yard work that's going on outside. If y'all can hear that, I apologize. I'll do my best in post to fix that. But anyway, yeah, I've been reading Lewis a lot, reading his work since high school. My first introduction to Lewis was in my English class, actually, when I was in boarding school. We read Screw Tape Letters, which was phenomenal. I'm obsessed with Screw Tape Letters. We'll get to that later. But ever since then, I found him so insightful, so helpful, and that hasn't changed in the last 7 years since I've continued to read him. I've read quite a bit of his nonfiction. Mostly is what I've read. Nonfiction. I've read his theological works. I read Screw Tape Letters, which is satirical, so in some sense it's fiction. Great Divorce, which is maybe his best book, or my favorite book, I should say. I'm reading through Narnia right now. I'm about halfway through that series. I've read all these biographies we're about to talk about. But yeah, I've been a fan, been a stan of Lewis. Been a stan of Lewis for probably 3 or 4 years. Been a fan of Lewis since high school. Um, I think the second book that I really delved into by him was Mere Christianity. We're going to go over both of those at some point, Screw Tape and Mere Christianity. But today I'm here to talk about Lewis biographies, because I had read a lot of the man, but I didn't know much of the man. And I wanted to. I was curious about his life. I didn't know too much. And I'll go within them, not the chronological order that I've read them, but in the order that I'll be talking about them today, in the order that I've been reading them recently. So when you think about Lewis biographies, there's a lot to choose from. I haven't read them all. As I said, I've only read three, probably 10 or more. Plus, I haven't done the math. Haven't looked them all up. If anybody knows, please comment below however many there are in total. And I know there's different editions. Of the one that I'm about to talk about has two different editions. So yeah. But this first one was the one I read, finished a few weeks ago, and then I finished the McGrath one probably in about a week during my summer break. Like 12 days. So this happens when you're in seminary year round. But yeah, this one is the revised edition from early. Well, it came out in 75 originally, and then this one was republished 74. Sorry, republished in 2002, and then the paperback edition I have came out in 2003 for the 40th anniversary of Lewis's death. This one is by Roger Lance Green and Walter Hooper, both people who knew Lewis personally. Roger Green was part of the Inklings for a while. He's written a lot about European medieval history, written some fantasy, different things like that. Definitely fits within that group. Hooper joined was, I guess, a part of a meeting that group had shortly before Lewis's death. And he actually became his secretary per se for a while before Lewis died in 63. So both of these men knew the man, and I'll just read this little excerpt from the beginning. I think it's kind of funny because Roger had known Lewis for a number of years, and he says, uh, "Why then?" This is in the preface to the first edition they had. It says, "Why then are we undertaking this book? As early as May 1953, Lewis suggests, so 10 years before he died, Lewis suggested to Roger Lancer Green that he should one day undertake his biography. When asked by his publisher, uh, Jocelyn Gibb of uh, of a publishing company, to write a more formal autobiography than Surprised by Joy. We'll get to that. Lewis replied, "Oh no, but when I'm dead, I suppose Roger will write my biography and Jock will publish it." So Lewis didn't expect us to be reading him 5 years after he died, but look at us 50 years. Uh, so yeah, this book, I'll contrast it with some of the other books I've read. This book, it is, how long is it? Just over 400 pages. It's about 430 pages. It does have quite a bit of footnotes. One thing I like about the structure of this biography is that at the end of every chapter, it gives the footnotes for that chapter, rather than in McGrath's where it has footnotes within, but all those are come at the very end at the index of the book. So I like having those references at the end of every chapter. Let me go on. So that's this book. Highly recommend. I recommend all these that I've read, but this one was very good. Let me talk about McGrath's for a second, and then I'll compare and contrast some of them. So, as I said, McGrath's biography, which my version looks like this. I had friends that had the friends in Zimbabwe actually that had the British version that has a way cooler cover. I don't like this cover. I don't like Fat Jack staring at me. Sorry, Lewis. Put your mug on there, just like real close up, cut off your forehead. Doesn't look great. I don't love the cover. But so as I said, this one was published. Um, this was the 40th anniversary for Lewis's death. This one, McGrath published for the 50th anniversary. So this one came out in 2013. So what am I, 8 years late? But here I am. Um, yeah, this book has, it's subdivided. Yes, we're already talking about structure. So this book is subdivided into the worlds in which Lewis inhabited, real and imaginary. Um, and with that, it is much more an exploration of. There's a lot more psychoanalysis that goes on here, which is fine. I don't mind that. I'm not against it. At some level, I appreciate it. And it's also just very much about the world. He spends 5 pages in the beginning talking about the conditions of Ireland, the Protestant and Catholic tensions that are very, very real when Lewis was a young boy, when even before he was born. And as it goes on, it very much is about how the worlds which Lewis was in, Cambridge, Oxford, Narnia, the Socratic Club, the very gentlemanly, very patriarchal world, is very much a part of what shaped Lewis and what shaped his writing, which is good. So it's honestly not even so much about Lewis. It is definitely because it's his biography. But if you read the book, you might get what I'm saying. It's much more about how the worlds around Lewis informed Lewis than than Lewis himself, and that was good, and I enjoyed that. And it's much more a bare bones story. This does not have as many of the footnotes, as many of the. It doesn't have as many first-hand sources embedded in the text, embedded in the story. Um, I mean, like just take for instance this page. There's two big block quotes there of pieces of writing. Uh, one of uh, somebody talking about Lewis, and then one a excerpt from uh, something Warney said, his brother, about the Inklings. And even on the page right before that, look, there's another big block quote in italics there. So this book, I don't think, yeah, the page before that, I don't think there's a page that goes by in the Hooper and Green biography that doesn't have some kind of big block quote from either a journal entry from somebody, article of response from somebody, something somebody in a book during that time of Lewis being alive, or some newspaper clipping, or some letter from Lewis, or some letter to Lewis from somebody else. So, and McGrath will mention those in a sentence or so. He will give you the information and then provide the citation, but he won't give it to you in itself. He will just mention it, or condense it in his own words, and then give the footnote. He won't give the text itself. And the letters of Lewis are big in both of these biographies. Obviously, if you're telling a story about a person, you're going to want to use their firsthand accounts, their firsthand thoughts, and then other people's firsthand thoughts, either in direct response to them, as in a letter, or of their influence in the time. So, so that's one thing. And so this book, McGrath's book, very much about the worlds of Lewis, real and imaginary, and how those affected Lewis as a person. This book by Green and Hooper, much more just about the man of Lewis, telling his story, much more focused on the literature of Lewis, both his actual writings. There's chapters in this book dedicated to Screw Tape Letters, Mere Christianity. There's a section that partially deals with his fiction, heavily quoting his own works, heavily quoting Surprised by Joy in the first few chapters even, but heavily quoting Mere Christianity and Screw Tape Letters, giving shape to how these things came about, how these things were written. There's much more to say about Lewis's vacations in his later life to Greece with his wife. There's a whole chapter spent on Lewis's marriage in this book, whereas there's just maybe 7 pages that McGrath spends. There's a section of a chapter spent about Lewis's marriage in this book. So even though this is only, oh gosh, what's the difference? So McGrath's is, I think it's just over 300. No, it's like 380. So just under 400. This book's like 3 in this print at least. It's 3, and you can see the like text size, a bit bigger, obviously bigger pages. 380 for this book. What did I say? Just over 430 for this book. So we're talking 50 pages of difference. Doesn't sound like a lot, but there's a lot of firsthand info in this book that's not explicitly presented in McGrath's book. And I count that as a loss. I like this one. Now, I like this one more just for pure information's sake. It took me a little bit longer to get into the flow of this book. And many of you, I haven't read many biographies in my life before this, so that might make sense to some of you. Some of you might be really familiar with reading biographies, and you're like, oh man, I know, their structure. I know kind of how they pace themselves. So it's easier for you to get into that world. I haven't read many biographies before this. I read the big, it's sitting here for my camera, but the big Metaxas Bonhoeffer biography last winter. And that it took me a while to get into that. It took me about 50 pages to understand his pace, understand how he was using the firsthand sources within the text there. So it took me a while to get into this book. Obviously, I read this one, and then straight after, I think the same day, I started the McGrath book. The McGrath book's way easier, way more accessible. His language is a bit simpler. He doesn't have all those in-text citations, all of those big block quotes. So he's just rattling along with his own voice. Whereas this gets broken up so much by the citations that sometimes it gets hard to differentiate and to snap back into, okay, this is Green, this is Hooper who are writing. But yeah, I prefer this one. There's some insights in that one that read second to me were good, and I could fill in a lot of the gaps. Like I said earlier, the whole chapter on marriage has spent the talk more of Lewis's marriage, his I don't think McGrath even mentions his vacation back to Ireland with his brother later in his life, a few years in the late 50s, I believe. Yeah, and again, there's whole sections dedicated to the literature of Lewis. So all that is to say, if you want one that's based on the literature of Lewis and more focused on that aspect of his life and how that shaped him, read this one. Read the new edition, the 40th anniversary from Green and Hooper. If you want something about the worlds of Lewis, to maybe you've read Narnia, maybe you've read a couple books, and you just want to know the straight story, the bare bones story, and some stuff about the worlds and how that influenced Lewis, read McGrath's. They're both worth reading. They're both good. I'm not trying to say McGrath didn't do a good job. I like McGrath a lot. We're going to be doing some reactions and thinking about some of the things he says and brings up about Lewis from this book for sure. But I just prefer the straight literary style. I just prefer the straight. How does the literature enhance Lewis, and what does it tell us about Lewis himself? So there's my recommendation as far as that goes. Now the third one, and I love this cover. You see it there. I don't know. It's not the best cover ever, but I really like it. I like it more than the other covers for this book. So, Surprised by Joy. Um, let's see. I forgot when it was originally published. So 55. This one came out. The green one, 10 years after that, about 12 years after Lewis's death. This one, 2013. Obviously, this one, the big difference, quite obviously, it's an autobiography. And this isn't about Lewis's whole life because he had lived his whole life at that point. Duh. But this is much about his conversion. Talks about his younger life for the first few chapters. Talks about boarding school for 3 whole chapters, and he briefly mentions being in World War One, which McGrath has things to say about that, which we might get into. He has some interesting thoughts, and I don't necessarily disagree. But this book is so much more about his conversion, him telling that story, and it's centered around this idea of joy. There's some great quotes from earlier in Lewis's thinking about joy that we'll get into once we get into this book that Green and Hooper reference in their book. But yeah, this I haven't read this in a few years. It was 2017 when I read this book. So I don't remember too much, to be honest with you. I don't. I'll say this: I hadn't read many biographies. I hadn't read many autobiographies. Obviously, at that point, I'd read 5 or 6 Lewis books at this point, and I want to know more about him. I Maybe I wasn't in a certain mind state to read it. Generally, um, I found it difficult. I found it hard to follow. And not to say that it's bad or Lewis is a bad writer. Obviously, he's a fantastic writer. But I'll be curious to see how I feel about it when I go through it again, because it centers on the theme of joy. It uses that as the thread through the whole book. So if Green's and Hooper's is about uh, how literary forms and literary things of Lewis and of those around Lewis shaped Lewis's life, there's that one. If McGrath's is how did the worlds around Lewis shape Lewis, the worlds which he was in, which he was around, and which he created shape him, then this one is how does joy shape Lewis's conversion? How do his thoughts about joy shape that? How do his chasings of joy from a young age shape his thoughts about God, about the world, about how to find that joy? Uh, so, yeah, I don't really remember. All I remember is it when I finished it. It was insightful and it was nice, and I enjoyed it. But I just found it tougher of a read. Maybe now that I've read a few biographies, it won't be as hard to grasp. It won't be as hard to get through. I'll understand more because I've read so much more about Lewis at this point that I can fill in some gaps. There's some things he doesn't even talk about in this book as a young man. His relationship with Mrs. Moore, he totally skips over. As I said, he doesn't talk about being in the war, so we can get to some of that and why those things are important, what those things tell us, maybe why he omits them, even. So, yeah, if you wanted to read a Lewis biography, I hope this has been helpful. Hopefully, I gave you some things to think about as far as how to approach those, what to do with some of them. So I will be reading Surprised by Joy here soon in the next few days, if not today. And Some videos will be coming about that. I'm thinking about just taking chapters, taking some themes from those in his life, talking about them, and then kind of how can I exegete it in a way that tells us some things about us, about our lives, and what we can learn from Lewis in telling about his life and his conversion and his search for joy.
They always say they going through it. Life is a female. Dog, that would be me. She said, let's go to Hong Kong, but I'm only 18. Ain't got money for Hong Kong. If she'd have asked me last year, I'd have been long gone.
Tell the truth, I need your hand. It's my problems like you once did. I'm too hot to talk to you no more, and I can't tell if it's you, cause you don't need pick up my calls no more. Left alone with all my thoughts. Maybe it's driving me crazy.